Good evening, everybody. Okay. First, just a quick announcement about timing, which is that justice is not for the faint of heart, but it may be for the sleepy. And so we're going to move this hour back to 6 p.m. starting next week. I hope that's not bad for any of you. I'm sorry if it is. I think it's good for some people, and is definitely good for your humble servants here at Ikar. So we synced it up with Minyan Tzedek, which is why it started at 7. But I think it's late for people, and we have people on the East Coast, and like I said, it's good for all of the Ikar working staff, including myself. So we're going to move this back to 6 p.m. Take note. That does not change the time that Minyan Tzedek meets. Okay. Let's say just a blessing together to thank God for this space that we have together where we can process concepts like justice. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Oh my gosh. I have been just looking around lately and feeling like where are the good leaders? You know, like where are the good leaders? Do you ever have this feeling? Like I know the bad ones and I know the not as bad ones, right? Like I can identify the difference between that, but we're like the good leaders. So it's like, we're in such a period of crisis. Where's like the great leaders, you know? Maybe you have some names, but I find myself coming up short. And that feeling, that landscape is the same feeling that we have when we look back at the world of Genesis, for early Genesis. That's the atmosphere. That's what the Torah has been describing. That's what we've been looking at, as a world that doesn't have any guidance, doesn't have any leaders, no good leaders, right? That's the world that Abraham steps onto. Okay, and Abraham, as far as the Torah is concerned, changes everything. Okay, Abraham was a good leader. I mean, good enough that we're still following him to a certain extent, right? Abraham was a good leader. And remember, last week we talked about Noah. Noah was a good person. Tzedek, he was a righteous person, Tzedek. But he wasn't a good leader. He wasn't that wasn't his power. Abraham started a movement, right? And we're still following along. So the question, one of the questions that the classic questions of our tradition is, why Abraham? What was it about that guy? God calls out to Abraham. So, okay, part of it is it's God. God sets Abraham on a mission. But why did God call out to Abraham? What was so special about Abraham? It's one of the all-time classic questions of the Torah, because the Torah is essentially like, you know, episode 1, the creation of the world. Episode 2, the story of the destruction of the world, right? And episode 3, God calls out to Abraham. So why Abraham? Well, there's lots of speculation, lots of like imagining that Abraham, there are texts that imagine that he was supernatural, he could like had powers. Maimonides takes a more rational approach and just imagines him to be a philosopher, in Maimonides' own image, who just sits and thinks there has to be a God to this world. There has to be a, right? Rabbi Brous has spoken of this through the language of the Midrash, like looking at a palace on fire and just, what's going on here? Is nobody in charge here? So there are lots of speculations, but from the text of the Torah itself, there are basically we have two big reasons why maybe Abraham was the one. Two major scenes that sort of define who Abraham is and what he represents. And in one of those scenes, and now things get a little weird, because in one of those scenes, one of the like defining scenes of Abraham's life, he stands up to God, challenges God. And in the other kind of famous scene, in Abraham's life, he submits to God. That sort of like crumbles before God. That's weird. They're not that far apart either in the Torah. Right? In one scene, he is vociferously advocating for justice, for human beings, human justice. And in the other scene, he sort of bows before divine justice, or is it justice at all? The divine will. Okay? So that's strange, difficult to reconcile, but it also presents us now with these two spheres, these two worlds of we've been asking the question, well, how do we know what is good? What is, and now we have these two realms. We have some human concern for justice, and then some divine desire for I don't know, divine justice, divine good, divine will. And those things can be in conflict. And that's our subject matter for tonight. Like, what does it mean when we seek good, we seek justice, we seek to know what is right through the lens of the Torah? And the Torah is our sort of spiritual reservoir. And yet the Torah seems to teach that you can challenge your spiritual inheritance. Okay? Now, so those two scenes are going to consume us for the next 2 weeks, for this week and next. And we're going to try as hard as possible to hold off tonight on considering the second scene, the most difficult scene maybe in all of our tradition, which is the binding of Isaac. Right? That's next week. We will talk about it. We're not going to talk about it tonight. So, of course, it's in our minds, it's even more famous than this scene, but we have to look at this scene first because it comes first and because it's the exact opposite movement. It is Abraham defining himself by saying, no, God, no. So far, you know, we've been dealing with people who either obeyed God and that was good, or they defied God and that was bad. But now we're going to have a challenge to God's goodness. Okay, and in doing that, what we're doing is we're introducing a new concept, and that's the concept that we've been moving towards all along, the concept of justice. Right? Justice is a human concept, is a social concept, right? We've been thinking about God may define the good, but justice somehow has to do with what's down here, and we're even going to see the word used for the first time in the Torah. Right, so it's really being introduced now. Okay, so let's try and spot. We're going to look at this passage, and we're not going to look at the whole thing. And it's probably very familiar to a lot of you, but I want to give us sort of the key drama here that introduces this concept of justice, and particularly introduces the idea that justice can be independent of God. It's a wild idea if God is the source of all things, the creator of the universe, the thing that all these people have been, the whole book is about having a relationship with. And yet suddenly the leader of our faith is saying, God, well, let's see what he says. Okay, so let's dive in here. Can you, if you would, Carrie is womaning our ship tonight, and has the source sheet for you. Can give everybody that link. Great. So that's the source sheet for you. And oh, you know what, Carrie? I think that's not. Is it linkable? Can you click on that? If not, it might need an HTTPS or whatever. Okay, I'm going to screen share it anyway. Some of you don't need it. And also, Carrie, if you could enable the live caption for those who might need it, if that's possible. Okay, let's take a look. This is scene one, and when I say scene one, I mean like major scene, essential scene, defining scene of who is Abraham 1, and that's here in Genesis chapter 18. Okay, so let's take a look. Now, the Eternal said to the Eternal Self, God's talking, and this is interesting because this is kind of how it gets introduced. And this is actually the first mention of the word justice. The Eternal had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? What is God about to do? God's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but we haven't found that out yet. Okay, but just there's a little heads up here. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him. For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity, his, those thereafter, and keep the way of the eternal. That all sounds like very good. He's going to be successful and obey God by doing righteousness and justice. Okay, here it is in the Hebrew. Lasot tzedakah umishpat. That's the word. That's the word we're going to be thinking about. It's new. That's the word we're going to be thinking about tonight. And we've seen this word before, tzedakah, righteousness, because Noah was righteous. Okay, but there's a new thing, justice. As we'll soon see, it's related to judging. Okay, so I've singled him out. He's going to keep the way of the eternal by doing righteousness and justice, and in order that the eternal may bring about for Abraham what has been promised to him. Okay, not totally clear what God is thinking here, but that's the introduction. And so God announces the plan. So the eternal said, and let me just, okay, we're heading into it. I want you to tell me, you to spot the moment when we've seen justice. Justice came on the scene, but so far it's God talking about justice. Soon we're going to see a moment where justice seems to suddenly move out and be independent of God. Okay, so can you spot that moment? So the eternal said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave, I will go down now to see whether they have acted according to the outcry that has reached me. But I will take note. I guess if yes, kaboom, right? This is Sodom and Gomorrah, literally where fire and brimstone, the phrase comes from, okay? Okay, then Abraham comes forward. Abraham would have been talking to a group of travelers, turns, I left out that line, the travelers leave. Abraham comes forward, Vayigash Avram. Abraham comes forward, like almost steps up and says, will you sweep away the righteous along with the wicked? Okay, there's the word we saw with Noah. Ha'aftis tzadikim rasha. Will you sweep away the righteous along with the wicked? What if there should be 50 righteous people within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the righteous 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the righteous as well as the wicked, so that the righteous and wicked fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? And the eternal answered, if I find within the city of Sodom 50 righteous ones. Okay, so this God heard, and God responds and says, you know what? You're right. If I find within the city of Sodom 50 righteous ones, I'll forgive the whole place for their sake, for the sake of the righteous. And you know how the story goes on. We're not going to, there's a whole back and forth, right? And just because it's a little repetitive, we're not going to go for it tonight. But you know how what comes next. Abraham spoke up saying, here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes, right? I'm so humble. Excuse me for even talking right now. But what if the 50 righteous should lack 5? What about 45? And then 40, and then 30, and then 20, and then 10. And Abraham argues God down to 10. If there are 10 righteous people, it's going to work. Unfortunately, it did not work. All right, so whatever happened, the God still destroys the city. Bad ending to this story. But for our purposes, let's just sink into this moment. Where is the critical moment where we suddenly have this idea that like justice is apart from God? Well, what's the moment? Can someone spot it's a little pop quizzy, which is not my style, but I want to really emphasize this moment. Anyone feel like Joe Schwartz?
It's at the end of line 25, the end of verse 25. I don't have the source file up on my screen. So.
First of all, your echo is tremendous, but you're exactly right also. This here, far be it from you. And actually the language is chalilalach, like almost like it would be a desecration for you. But Joe's exactly right. This is the line. This is the line. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Now, Joe, will you say why? Tell me why that's with your booming voice that it's like a DJ
Yeah,
voice.
any better now, or is it still?
No, it's great. It's great. Keep going.
Okay. Because he's talking about the judge of the earth, meaning God, and he's talking about dealing justly. So obviously, therefore, Abraham must have some concept of what justice should be. If he's calling out God on it and saying, be just, deal justly, obviously he's got some reckoning there.
Good. Okay, beautiful. Now we're in. That's exactly right. Thank you, Joe. That's the deal. That's the moment. Because we see if Abraham is calling God to justice, God, you have to act justly, then there's some possibility that God might not be asking. And more to the point, as Joe put it, Abraham is appealing to some external standard. There's something out there called justice, and Abraham is saying, look, this doesn't seem like justice to me. This is not justice, God. How dare you? I'm God. Whatever I say is justice. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Okay? So that's a big deal. Now we have to ask, okay, what is justice? What is Abraham's claim? What is his concept of justice? He's suddenly appealing to it. What is the nature? What is unjust? What does God need to deal with, face? Can I have some thoughts on that? What's the nature of Abraham's claim here against God? Rabbi Elman. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, Paula.
Can I just
go ahead?
To unmute.
Go for it.
Okay. First of all, God has talked about justice in the preamble that you read for us. And he recognizes what, well, either he recognizes the quality that's in Abraham, which I believe is the reason Abraham was chosen, or rather he believed that God believed that Abraham would become a man of justice. And he says, and so I'm going to tell him what I'm going to do. So my view has been for a while that actually this is a test. God is smiling during this conversation because he wants Abraham to stand up for justice and say, God, you're not doing it right. You're not being fair. You're going to, for the sake of your idea, they're going to kill too many innocent people.
Okay, fine. In that case, I mean, I think that's a lovely read, right? God, after all, mentions the very word, want to make Abraham a justice doer, and then Abraham mentions that word. It's almost like ding, 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 you got it. Justice is the thing. That's right. So actually, there may be a way in which God wants Abraham to question. But our question stands. God now is pointing to the justice thing. Now, it softens a little bit if God is thinking in the way that Rabbi Elman suggests, which is that it's, God is on the side of justice. But still, there's something else, something like that Abraham could conceive of a God that did not do justice. What's up with that? Okay, Paula, may I turn to you? Paula Perlman.
So I was thinking, hi.
Hi.
I was thinking that at the beginning, God has this awareness about hiding, being deceptive, really hiding what he's planning on doing. And Abraham's calling him on treating everybody the same. And we already saw that Noah treated everybody the same, didn't call out, what about the righteous? What about this? But here God is doing it again. Like I'm going to kill, everybody, the righteous with the what are they called? The people who are evil.
Yes, great. You did a couple of really nice things for us there, Paul. First of all, I think you're exactly right. The claim is you're not going to look at individuals. You're just going to do a kind of a sweep, right? You're just gonna, everybody's this, like all people, just knock all these people. You're not gonna think about everybody's individual behavior, right? It's the same kind of like sweep, and this is the other kind of beautiful connection you made, Paula, which is the same thing that was going on in Noah's time. Everybody just sort of like wash them all away, and Noah didn't stand up for that. That's not Noah didn't make exactly that. What if there are righteous people here? And we might say at the end of the story there weren't righteous people, but Abraham thinks to say, wait a minute, there's something unjust about innocent people suffering because of the guilty. They don't deserve it. There's some claim there that to do that. So this is not a divine ethic, but it's not a utilitarian ethic either. It's not like, well, whatever's best for the whole. No, there's some claim here that if you, God, bring punishment on those who do not deserve punishment, that will be unjust. Okay? Anyone want to add to that? Anyone want to build on that concept of justice? Okay. All right. So there we have it. That's the moment. That's the kind of the turning point where it becomes possible to imagine that there's something out there called justice. And now we're really kind of now so great. And you're supposed to do it. God says that, and Abraham does it. But how does Abraham know what it is? Where do you get that idea? Where does this mysterious it's more mysterious than God itself. Right? God, at least, I don't know, the creator of the world, something had to be hovering. Where does justice come from? Where did it poof? Like where did this concept come from? Any kind of thoughts on how does one know what justice is? How did Abraham know? It's a stumper, huh? It's a stumper. All right, let me give you some answers that have emerged in the tradition, in rabbinic tradition. I'm going to give you some of the classic answers. The next text in particular is, or I should say, the next piece of Talmud that we're going to look at in particular is a kind of a classic statement of how do we get to justice? Before we go there, Rabbi Brous, do you have a thought on this?
I don't know where you're going, so I don't want to preempt something, but I do want to ask a question about the shift that Abraham goes through between verse 24 and verse 25. And it's almost like he's trying to figure out what the justice ethic actually is. Initially, and you'll see we see a bit of back and forth in this, but in verse 24, there's a suggestion that if the whole place isn't rotten, then the whole place should be saved. Like if there's some good there, then the place should be saved. But then in verse 25, the problem is bringing death upon the wicked and the righteous. In other words, that it would be just to punish the wicked, but not just to punish the righteous. And so there's a shift even in the way that Abraham is thinking about it. And it feels to me always like he's trying to figure out what this independent ethic actually is. Does it mean that if there's any righteous that everybody should be saved, or that if there's any righteous that the righteous should be saved, and God's being it's too broad a brush that these cities are being painted with? I don't know if you want to address that or if it's going to take us off track here.
Yeah, no, that's great. That is such a great read. Everybody followed that at first it seems like Abraham is saying, if there are righteous in the city, you should not. And then this claim shifts a little bit. I'm just restating, just so we were all clear on what I think is a very nuanced and a very important read. Then it's like, well, wait a minute. You could kill the wicked, but what does it mean to kill the righteous along with it? But what's so I think important about what Rabbi Brous is suggesting is that Abraham's in a process, right? I just asked the question, how do you know? Well, it's not like Abraham knows. It's not like any of us know, but Abraham's trying to figure it out and actually encountering some resistance. And so he's like, well, what about this? No, but there's still a problem. But that doesn't. Now, what is moving Abraham from step to step? How is Abraham making those? What's going on inside of him that allows him that's a question. But I think Rabbi Brous is right that there's a process being described here. And how do we go through that process? How will we come to know what justice is? God seems to want that. Okay. All right. Alex, I see your hand, but I'm just gonna hold it and take a look at the next text, and then I'll come back to you. Okay. So let's see now. Now that we've got this concept of justice out there, right? We know that it can be referred to. We know it can be used to challenge God, and we are now trying to figure out, okay, well, how does one arrive to it? We've just had Rabbi Russ has just given us one version of an answer to that, which is, well, by struggling towards it, like kind of shifting in one's. Okay, but the word mishpat is also used, and this is important, and it's very important, I think, in Jewish tradition. It's also used. It's used to mean justice. It's also used to mean law. Okay, law, and that's law is a big topic in this tradition we sit in. Rabbi Brous and I spent a lot of time studying the law, probably a lot more time studying the law than we actually ever end up applying the law. Right? It's like a huge. It's been the mainstay of Jewish study for a long time. Law's a big deal. So it is also quite significant that we've got this concept of justice, and we start using the same word for some of our laws. Some of them, but not all of them. Okay, so let's take a look. Because in the book of Leviticus, we see this same word, mishpat, come up again, and here I'm translating it as my laws. Et mishpatai ta'asu, my laws shall you perform. But then there's another kind of law, another word at least, ve'et chukotai tishmeru, and my rules you shall keep. Okay, so it seems like there's two sets of laws, and one of them are the justice laws, and then there are these other laws. So what do we do with that? How do we split the difference? And the Talmud has a famous answer, and I would say in some ways this might be the most important piece of Talmud on the topic of law. Most important piece, I'm making a strong claim here, but most important piece of rabbinic jurisprudence here. Okay, what is the difference between certain kinds of laws and other kinds of laws? And I'm not just taking us into law because, hey, well, that's where the tradition went, but because soon you'll see that this discussion of law gets us back to the question of, well, how do we know what a just law is? Okay, our rabbis taught, it says in Leviticus, my laws, mishpatai, you shall perform. What are mishpatai? Such commandments which, even if had not been written, justice would demand that they should be written. And these are, and there's the list, idolatry, sexual immorality, murder, theft, and blasphemy. Now, you might not agree with everything on this, but think about this. The claim is being made that, and there's a different word used here, so I'm not sure I'm using the right word. Din, justice would demand. Dinhu, it is only right, it is just that they be written. Okay, and so so what's the claim there? What's the claim? If you didn't write down these things in the Torah, then what? Then what? What does it mean that justice would demand that they be written? Okay, let's take a look at the second. Maybe it'll be helpful to take a look at the second piece here. Let's take a look. Because there's a difference. And my rules, chukotai, you shall keep. So there's two different kinds of laws. There's the kind that justice demands, and then there's another kind. These are the commandments that the Satan challenges. Remember, Satan's not like the devil in our tradition, but some sort of like naysaying angel that hates people. So these are the commandments that the Satan challenges, and they are not eating pork, not wearing woolen linen, the exemption procedure from the obligation to marry a widowed sister-in-law. That's pretty intricate. They needed a whole phrase for that one. The purification of the leper, the Yom Kippur scapegoat sacrifice. And perhaps someone will say, these are meaningless things. Therefore, the verse ends, I am the eternal. In other words, I, the eternal one, have decreed it, and you are not allowed to question it. Okay, so two sets of laws here. There are these laws, which are chukim, and then there are the justice laws. So I ask you again, what's the difference? What's the difference between the laws that, like, you know, you would think they were silly, but the Torah says to do them anyway, and the other ones that justice would have demanded that they be written? What does that mean? Sean?
So you frame the question in a way that goes to something that keeps bothering me, which is, why is God even having these conversations with people like Noah and Abraham? I mean, why even ask? Why even engage? Why not just do it? And it's this characteristic of God that is sometimes not all that pleasant, right? I mean, God seems to have a fairly healthy ego, God's feelings get hurt quite a lot. God likes to threaten, you know, God's a little bit of a paper tiger. I'm going to punish you. And then somebody says, no, don't do that. Please don't do that. And so to answer your question in that framework, which is a challenging framework for us, right? Why even engage in the first place? Of what use to God is Noah? Of what use to God is Abraham? Maybe, and this is theologically difficult, maybe the mishpatai are greater even than God somehow, some aspect of the Godhead. These are greater, and the chukotai are these very interrelational, personal things like, well, if you're my friend, these are the things you're going to do. If you're my people and I'm your God, these are the things that we do because we're special for each other. But it's a very clear distinction, and I'm not sure that we can ascribe the one to the other, and it raises much bigger questions about the limits of God's power or the limits of God's sort of moral authority in the broader scheme.
Okay, this is great. Okay, what you're saying is very provocative. But first, you did some good, helpful work for us in kind of defining terms. It does seem that there are two categories of law here, and one is the things that God decided, God's will, God wants this, right? And the other one is a category of law that it's not God who decided these things. Justice demands these things, right? And you can hear it even in that description that Sean's more provocative point, but it emerges naturally, which is, well, I just described two sets of law. One was just kind of the random things I wanted you to do. That's almost how it sounds. Just do it. And Sean gave some reason. You want to be in a relationship with me? This is how you be religious. That's nice. But then there are these other things, and it seems loftier. There are things, and Sean even says, are they above God? God is appealing to justice. When God writes God's Torah, God includes some things for God, and then just the obvious things that justice demands. And then justice becomes almost like something that God is subservient to. It's something that God must adhere to, must obey, must acknowledge. And that's a wild thing to say, and yet it does seem to emerge rather naturally from this distinction. Emily?
I think that this set of paragraphs you shared is more like about why the Jews invented God. So justice exists. It's saying justice exists independent of God, but that's pretty lofty. And then we create God in order to give us a bunch of other rules, some more meaningful than others, to help us meet those laws. That after all these, after Sodom and Gomorrah and the flood, we know that humans have a hard time committing to justice on their own. So we create this God who will sort of keep us in check and keep us working for justice by giving us a bunch of rules, but those are separate and those are tied to God. And as you said, those gives us a relationship to God. In other words, it gives us a relationship to seeking justice.
Okay. You and I, Emily, probably have different theologies. I wouldn't go all the way down the road of we create God, but fair enough. It's a fair assessment, because like one can come at this as an atheist because part of what emerges from this is some sense that, I mean, from the Talmud itself, that a society doesn't need God in order to be a just society, right? There's a humanist, just society would come up with these very same laws that the Torah does. Thou shalt not kill. That's not like that's not even our God's brilliant idea. That's just the way it is. Now, the question that I'm trying to ask is, well, the way it is, why? Like, is it like it's obvious? Or is it like there's a natural order, there's a law, it's a principle out there, as Shamazich is almost like higher than God? Or is it more like what I heard in Rabbi Brause's description, which is that it's a process. It's like any society would eventually figure out, they would instinct their way, or they would trial and error their way. They would think their way to these things. Reason would bring them there. Experience would bring them there. I'm just like throwing out possibilities for what now emerges as a relatively mysterious concept. It's both obvious and also kind of transcendent in such a way that one wonders, where does this come from? Okay, Esra.
Right, two thoughts. One relates to like no answer for the etiology, the etiology, like the origin of where this justice notion comes from. But what I'm imagining is when you said humanistic notion of justice that may be separate from God, it's almost as though God is aware, perhaps humbly so, that God doesn't know what it is to be human. God doesn't know what it is God doesn't have the lived experience of being human, but Abraham does, right? Because Abraham is human. So from that point, the second thing that maybe I'm reading into this, because again, I want to read this into the Torah, but wouldn't it be exciting for me to read into the Torah? It sounds like Abraham is almost perhaps arguing for a notion of restorative justice, so that it's not just for the 50 righteous amongst the whole city of evil people, or the 5 righteous, but that within every evil person is the capacity to also be righteous. Would that they could have been reached in a way that maybe our divine God hasn't figured out yet. Okay. So, everyone has the capacity for both evil and good, perhaps. So,
that's dynamite. That's dynamite. I'm so excited by what you're saying, because that's like, it's also quite provocative, but in some ways, actually, it's sympathetic to God. And that's suggesting that justice is a human concept, and God, for that reason, can't fully understand it. It's about dealing with human needs, real situations, individuals. God doesn't, I don't know, God's just, what is God? God's just like, there's good, there's bad coming up from the world, right? Like, of course, people have to be the ones articulating what it feels like to live down here under this regime. And does this feel like a just order? The word justice, mishpat, I should say, is related to the word for order. It's like a judging, right? Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. The judge, justice. Those words are related because it's about a kind of a process of judgment. I'm turning back again to Rabbi Brause's description, a process. Like, oh, then what about this? It's a thoughtful process. And God's just seeing the big picture. I love that description. Alex.
Shalom. What I'm thinking is, because God is not a philosopher, he speaks direct and clear. And who needs justice? God doesn't need justice. Human needs justice. So why human needs to learn justice? Because if you go back to all the way back the Garden of Eden, and we see that over there, evil and righteousness. And God, I think, wanted teaching Abraham to distinguish the differences between righteousness is God, and the weakness is evil. So that is, in order to the human being, and Abraham needs to understand what is the differences, or what's the difference between God and evil. Human beings should understand and learn what is justice and righteousness, and be the side of righteous, to be righteous, side of God. And if
Okay.
you
All
are
right.
not able to distinguish
All right.
those
Yeah.
concepts, and as a human being, you are in trouble. So the God wanted to teach Abraham justice.
I think that you are making a very important connection, Alex. You're in some ways threading us through all of the work we've done so far, because that's exactly right. So far, we've been trying to distinguish just between what does it mean to even know the difference between good and evil? What are these basic concepts of what is right and what is wrong, right? Now that's something that that can happen in a very closed space, right? That can happen just with me, just in my own person. I can do a right or a wrong thing. But now we're talking about justice. We're thinking about, beginning to look out at a society. What is good or evil for this society, right? Like how do we apply these principles broadly? And Alex says, also, like, how do I distinguish between that which is righteous for me? Noah was able to do that, to stay righteous, and that which is going to work for the whole. And maybe things can't actually always be 100% righteous or 100% good. Once you're weighing, look, there's some evil people, there's some good people. You can't just drop a nuclear bomb. It's complicated. Yeah, I wish you could get rid of those people, poof, too, but that's not. Then people will suffer. It's too complicated once you're looking at the big picture. Okay. Take a couple of more comments, and then I want to look at one last sort of rabbinic pass on the concept of justice. Andrea Abramson?
I maybe unrelated, but as I'm listening, 1 second, I have a eager participant. My dog, no, sorry. I was listening to you, and I'm going just back to the beginning, and I may be mispronouncing mishpatai.
Yes,
and ukotai. And I remember when you were teaching my son for his bar mitzvah, the idea of civil laws, right? So it's a difference between, there are certain laws that are universal and of humanity, and thinking in terms of what we're living today with fake news and the idea that everything, First Amendment, opinions become facts. I think it's kind of establishing what's non-negotiable.
Yeah.
You don't kill.
Yeah.
And then the other things, I think the hukotai, I see a little bit more kind of like, it's represented today, as we can see. We have reform, do you see that I'm on a line? You have reform, and then you have, allowed us to have this plethora of Judaism. So that's kind of how I understand, is like, there's some things that you can negotiate, and you can still be Jewish and you're still a good person, but you shall not kill or whatever. Thanks.
Yeah. That's great, Andrea. That's great, because you're right. I think that this text is doing more than saying that there is something called justice, and here I am, I'm problematizing. What is it? Where does it come from? But even in the description of things that any society would inevitably arrive at, there's a kind of a statement of moral law here. Actual, dare I say, absolutes. There are things that are always wrong. And now I'm not saying that, thou shalt not kill, and I'm sure we could figure a situation in which it is right to kill, but there's some principle that is actually essential there. And that's like, there's some truths out there, in other words, some moral truths out there. That's a phrase which makes me like a little nervous. I tend to be a moral relativist, but that's what I think that is the deep implication of this description in the Talmud. All right, let's take a comment from Tara.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't have that list in front of me right now, but does this list, is this list the Noahide laws that bind all the people?
These.
Yes.
Yeah. I think yes, that's right. All of these laws appear in what we think of as the laws that the first peoples, Noah and his children, were given. Idolatry, sexual immorality, that all human beings not just would inevitably get to, but actually the Torah imagines, or rabbinic traditions imagines, are bound by.
And then the other laws, like that, the extras that go into the 10 Commandments, beyond those come later and make us Jewish, like when we're accepting those.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So what do you make of that, Tara?
What?
So what do you want to, anything else on that distinction?
I think for the first section, it's just the basis that binds all of humanity. And that's like preemptive to whether we're Jewish or not, because then we chose to accept God and be Jewish later, but this is for all of mankind.
Okay. So now that's
it's
really
like bigger than just one religion.
Yeah, now that's really interesting, because now we've identified not just a concept of justice that exists outside of God, but also a universal human ethic, universal law, universal goodness. And as Tara's describing it here, it's fascinating. The Torah wants to contain both. The Torah presumes to bring to you both justice, those universal principles, and also how to be Jewish. Also, this particular spiritual path, as Sean was saying before, a way of having a connection, this kind of connection to God. And that's great. But the Torah has both things. It wants to have the principles of justice in it, and it also wants to have the holiness that comes from practicing these particular ways. Now, that's nice, as I just described it, because it sounds like the Torah does both. The Torah has all the justice in it, and the Torah has some extra stuff, the holiness in it, okay? But here's another, that's like, justice and, the Torah encompassing all, but here's another description of the Torah, and the rabbis are continuing to ask the question, is God enough? Is the Torah enough? Right? Is our received religious tradition enough to keep us just? Take a look at this next passage from the Talmud. It's a strong statement by Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said that Jerusalem was destroyed because they ruled only based on Torah law. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan, who sort of started the Jewish community up again after saw Jerusalem destroyed, and he says it was destroyed because they ruled only based on Torah law. Wait, what are you talking about? What a great thing to rule on, Rabbi Yochanan. What do you think we are supposed to rule on? That's the next voice in the Talmud. And the Talmud says, Eladine megizata ladaino? Should they have decided cases based on the laws of the Magians? There's some debate over what this word means. Does it mean like thieves or arbitrary? But I like this translation best. Like, the Magi, the wise men, right? Like, or just some is there some other system of law that we were supposed to appeal to? Is there some, you imagine there's another civilization that has better laws than ours? No, the rabbis can't imagine that, right? What, appealing to Roman law here? No, rather say it was that what did Rabbi Yochanan mean? He meant that they established their rulings on the basis of Torah law, but did not go beyond the letter of the law. Did not go beyond lifnim mireshut hadin, beyond the lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the line of the law. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan says the city was destroyed because they only used the Torah to decide things, and they didn't go beyond the Torah. They should have gone beyond the Torah. What does it mean to go beyond the Torah? How do you read that? What does it mean to go beyond the letter of the law? That was Rabbi Yochanan said is the whole problem. Anyone have any thoughts on that? I've gotten a lot of silence tonight, but it's okay. because I've got text prepared for you. Joe, what do you think?
It's kind of like if you think about something like building a fence around the Torah, like the kosher laws, for example, might be an example of this, where they took something that was literally in the Torah, like do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, and they expanded that. They took it to logical conclusions that weren't specifically written. And I think that might be what he's talking about.
That's beautiful. What a great little analogy you've given us, Joe. That's right, because we have this concept of a fence around the Torah. You build there's the law, and then you go even further. But usually we think about that fence with respect to chukim, to these sorts of like religious, you can't eat a cheeseburger, so don't eat a chicken cheeseburger as well. Let's just be cautious. Let's just make sure that we don't go anywhere near the law, right? But now we're talking about justice, right? Talking about justice, din. So when they judged, they didn't just use the justice principles, and they should have gone further, right? Drawing a fence. What would it mean to do the same kind of like cheeseburger to chicken cheeseburger from thou shalt not steal to like, what are the implications of not stealing? How far do I have to go there? Okay. All right, let's take one more comment, and then we're going to see an illustration of exactly that kind of work. Alexandra?
This is similar to, I think it was Joe's comment, and I may be misquoting, but I think in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's Rabbi Ben Azai who said that a greater principle than the golden rule of love your neighbors more than you love yourself, that there is a principle greater than that, which is that this being the Torah is the book of the generations of Adam, which I understand to mean that that is the book that was given to those people in those generations. And those were the laws that applied as they were written to those generations. But as humanity evolves, as humans move forward, as societies evolve and people change, we need to change the way that we look at the laws, and we need to evaluate. And that is a greater principle of Torah than love your neighbor as you love yourself.
What I love this. This is a particular version of going beyond the letter of the law. It's an unusual version, but I think a very compelling one, which means the Torah has to keep going. It has to keep extending its line. It is a growing project, right? We evolve in our concept of justice. We get new and new heights of justice. And just like we're not offering the sacrifices anymore, so some of the principles of justice, we've gone to new levels. Right? That is certainly one way to read the rabbinic project. They just stuck with the Torah, but they didn't address the new concerns of justice. Okay, yeah. Stephen, Volk?
Yeah, I would just sort of expand a little bit on that and go back to the cheeseburger, because there is a law which will say, don't eat a cheeseburger. But the question of justice requires that we also think about whether it's right to eat meat, to kill animals, right? And so the essential sort of question that's always there is in our own mind of trying to figure out within these rules and going beyond the law, where justice lies in relationship to the law. And if we're left to the letter of the law, then justice, as we know in our own society, often falls way outside that letter. And so what I'm reading from this is that the kinds of questions we have within these passages are the ways in which we are constantly provoked to think about where justice really lies, rather than depending on the laws that we have written or that are written in the Torah to give them to us.
Yeah, great. That is a great example. A great example. The Torah, as written, seems to allow us to eat meat. It is mutar. It's permissible to eat meat. But is it right to eat meat? Something to think about. Something to think about even from the text of the Torah itself. It seems to have been a concession that was made to know. But just like as we grow in our understanding of the species around us and of what pain is. Like, do we get to a place where we say, wait, no, you know, this is just right. My tradition didn't teach it to me, but I'm coming to understand it. I'm coming to understand it. But, you know, I'll give you I'll end maybe with a story. You can read the last text on your own, but just because you give that example, it's sort of a perfect illustration of a different perspective. That Torah is the only law. So I was in yeshiva with you know, with guys. It was all guys. I was in yeshiva with a bunch of guys, and one of them was a vegetarian. And yeshiva food is not so veggie friendly, but he always had his little, you know, his little corn patties and his little, like, poor guy was always like kind of having to make his own food. Anyway, we went to this, like, that was one of the things you do is you go to this rabbi's house for Shabbat lunch, and you all sort of sit humbly and try to curry his favor. And at this rabbi's house for Shabbat lunch, it was British rabbi. I just say that because it makes the sound of the response better. And but you know, a lot of these rabbis, I got to say, looking back, it was like a lot of like, it was like their whole kind of way of religious instruction is a little obnoxious. But anyway, they're passing the food around, and it comes to Joe, and it's a plate of chicken, and he says, "Oh no, thank you. I'm a vegetarian." And I don't know if, like, the way he said it sounded too like I'm special, but that's not the way I recall it. It was just sort of, "Oh no, thanks, I'm a vegetarian." And the host goes, "Ah, a vegetarian. Hitler was a vegetarian. Pass the chicken?" Which was such an obnoxious moment. But what was his point? His point was like, don't come up with all these newfangled ideas of what's good and right. Like, the Torah says we can eat meat, you can eat meat. And I'll find you a moral monster who believed in vegetarianism. See, the Torah is the only authority. And that is a certain perspective. That is a certain formulation of our religious tradition. The Torah is the source of all justice and all goodness. And I do not think that that is a correct perspective. I do not think from the reading of the Torah itself that that's the concept of justice that we get. And so what Stephen is saying, that, like, we have to, and what Alexandra's saying, we have to keep looking, we have to keep searching, we have to keep thinking, we have to keep pushing ourselves to go beyond, to keep searching, to keep being in process. All right, Browse, any last thoughts on your end?
I think that was a perfect close.
Okay.
Beautiful.
All right, so we'll end there. Remember, next week is 6 p.m. We're starting at 6 p.m. I hope that's good for most of you. Certainly good for us. And wishing you a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Wow, beautiful.